The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of Los Angeles. Keanu Reeves drove his car slowly, the hum of the engine breaking the silence of the late afternoon. The city was still alive with the echoes of busy people, but for him, this moment of solitude was a rare gift. The Ferrari's sleek curves reflected the orange glow of the setting sun as he turned the corner and spotted a small, unassuming McDonald's on the corner of the street. There was no rush, no flashes of cameras, just a quiet corner where he could be left alone for a few minutes. He parked and stepped out, stretching his legs before heading inside. The scent of fries and burgers hit him as soon as he walked through the door. The familiar buzz of conversation and laughter surrounded him, children running around, families enjoying their meal. It felt like the world was moving at its usual pace, indifferent to the man who just walked in. Keanu made his way to the counter, ordering a simple meal, his mind momentarily free of the weight of fame, of the world he left behind. He found a seat in the farthest corner, away from prying eyes. His phone was off, tucked away, and for the first time in hours, he could breathe without the world watching. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw him. A small figure, barely noticeable among the crowd. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his face pale, his eyes darting around like he was searching for something, or someone. Clutched in his small hands was a broken toy car, barely held together. The boy's gaze locked onto Keanu, and for a moment, there was nothing but a silent understanding between them. The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening around the toy. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His gaze shifted briefly to the man sitting across the table, the one who seemed to be watching him intently. Then, like a spark igniting, the boy stood up, clutching the toy to his chest, and walked toward Keanu. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade as the world shrank to just the two of them. When the boy reached Keanu's table, he stopped, his tiny frame shaking slightly. His eyes flickered between Keanu and the man in the suit, who was now looking up from his phone, a cold, calculating look crossing his face. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was so quiet, Keanu had to lean in closer. The words that came next chilled him to the bone. "I don't want to go with him, he's not good. He's going to take my mom," the boy whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Keanu froze. The meal in front of him forgotten, his heart pounding suddenly. A wave of realization hit him hard, and for a split second, the world around him seemed to blur. The man, the one sitting so calmly, wasn't just some random stranger. This wasn't a casual meeting, it was the beginning of something much darker. The little boy's eyes filled with tears as he glanced back toward the table. Keanu's gaze followed, locking onto the man who now stood up, adjusting his suit, a smirk playing on his lips. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Keanu's instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he pulled out his phone. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a tension that no one else seemed to notice. The click of his phone as he dialed 911 was almost too loud in the stillness between them. The boy's whisper had set something in motion that neither of them could stop. Keanu's heart raced as the boy's words echoed in his mind. He kept his gaze fixed on the child, whose small body was trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. The air between them was thick with unspoken fear, yet the boy's courage to speak up, to trust Keanu in this moment, cut through the tension like a knife. The man, who had been sitting quietly at the table, was now standing, making his way toward them with slow, deliberate steps. The smirk never left his face. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that held a threat, a warning, but one that only Keanu seemed to understand. His hand instinctively reached for the phone in his pocket, fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the number for the police. The boy flinched as the man got closer, his small body instinctively pulling away from the looming figure. The man, now standing over them, towered in stark contrast to the vulnerable child. "Ethan," he said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm, as if nothing was wrong, as if this was just another ordinary day. "Come on, buddy, it's time to go." You know your mom needs you at home. But the boy, Ethan, shook his head, his grip tightening on the broken toy car. He looked up at Keanu with desperate eyes, searching for reassurance, silently begging for someone to stand up for him, to tell him he wasn't crazy, that he didn't have to go back with this man. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment settling into his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift deep within him. This wasn't just about a lost child, it was about protecting someone who had no one else to turn to. The man's patience was wearing thin. He looked at Keanu, his smile faltering for the briefest moment, his posture becoming more rigid, more threatening. I said, "It's time to go," he repeated, his voice colder now. "You're not his hero, Reeves. Just a guy who plays one on screen." Keanu stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's. He took a step forward, positioning himself between Ethan and the stranger, his body language firm, unyielding. The sound of the restaurant faded away, replaced by the soft, rhythmic beat of his own heart. "You're not taking him anywhere," Keanu said, his voice steady, but there was an undeniable authority in it. The man's eyes darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world had held its breath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, do you?" he said, his words laced with venom. He took a step forward, his posture menacing, but Keanu didn't flinch. The air was charged now, a standoff between two strangers with completely different worlds, and yet both of them knew this was a battle that couldn't be avoided. Ethan was frozen, his small hand still gripping the toy as if it were the only thing holding him together. Keanu glanced down at him, offering a silent promise that he would be safe. He shifted his stance, subtly blocking the boy from view. "I'm not letting you take him," Keanu repeated, his voice unwavering. "And you can either walk out of here peacefully, or you can deal with the consequences." The man scoffed, clearly taken aback by Keanu's defiance. For a split second, his smirk faded into something more dangerous, a look of someone who thought they could control everything. But Keanu stood his ground, his presence a calm fortress that seemed to shield Ethan from the storm gathering just beyond the walls of the restaurant. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with an unsaid promise of what was to come. Keanu's hand hovered near his phone, waiting, watching, every muscle in his body primed for what he knew was inevitable. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a rescue. And he wasn't going to let Ethan down. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, calculating, sizing up the situation. He turned toward the door, his fingers twitching as if he might make a move to leave, but then he hesitated. His gaze fell back on Keanu, then to Ethan, then back to Keanu. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, just loud enough for only the two of them to hear. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold as ice. "You don't know what I'm capable of." Keanu's response was simple, yet profound. "I'm about to find out," he said, his tone firm, determined. And just like that, the moment of uncertainty passed. There was no turning back now. The door swung open. A faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder, closer, until the unmistakable wail of police cruisers filled the space, signaling that help was on the way. The man's eyes darted toward the sound, but it was too late. The cavalry had arrived, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Keanu knew he had made the right choice. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. And in that moment, everything changed. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the restaurant, as if the universe was finally catching up to the moment that had been building for so long. The man's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching slightly, as if he was weighing his options. Keanu didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the man, unwavering. Ethan stood behind him, small, fragile, but steady, as though he had placed all his trust in Keanu in this single moment. The door swung open again, this time with more urgency. The sound of heavy boots on the tiled floor filled the space, and two officers entered, their expressions hard and focused. Keanu didn't look back, he knew they were there, but his attention remained fixed on the man in front of him. He was a wall, immovable, with every intention of standing his ground until the very end. The stranger's smile faltered for a second. It was fleeting, but Keanu noticed it. He could feel the man's nerves beginning to crack. "This isn't over, Reeves," the man sneered, his eyes darting toward the officers now scanning the room, aware that things were no longer in his control. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had been made clear. He was here to protect Ethan, no matter the cost. He watched as the man took one step back, his hand twitching toward the door, eyes flicking between Keanu and the approaching officers. The moment stretched like a taut wire, and Keanu could feel the electricity in the air, the tension about to snap. "Step away from the child," Officer Ramirez commanded, his voice firm, unyielding. The man's gaze locked with Keanu's for one final moment, a silent challenge passing between them. But the man was no longer in charge of the situation. His bravado melted away, replaced by something colder, something far more dangerous, but Keanu knew that wasn't enough. Not anymore. Without another word, the stranger took a step back, his jaw clenched, the tension in his posture still sharp but no longer commanding. He had been beaten, not physically, but mentally, and Keanu could see the defeat behind the man's eyes. The moment of reckoning had arrived. And in that brief moment of quiet, Keanu knew the battle wasn't over yet, but they were winning. Officer Vega approached, her eyes scanning the man with a mix of suspicion and authority. She moved quickly, her voice sharp as she said, "You're under arrest." The words rang in the air like a bell, final and irrefutable. The man's eyes flickered to the officers, then to Keanu, his jaw tightening. Keanu remained calm, his body still between the man and Ethan. There was nothing left to do now but let the officers do their work. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the room, a small but significant victory for Ethan. The man was being led away, but as he passed Keanu, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're messing with." The threat was clear, but Keanu didn't flinch. He had seen this before. Words were meaningless when backed by nothing but emptiness. As the man was escorted out of the restaurant, Keanu turned to Ethan, his expression softening. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level, offering a gentle smile. "You did great," Keanu said, his voice steady and filled with reassurance. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide, as though he couldn't quite believe that it was over. The weight of the moment still lingered, but there was something else too. A sense of relief, of quiet triumph. Ethan slowly let go of his broken toy, the tension in his small body easing. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. And Keanu, despite everything, couldn't help but feel proud of the child's courage. Officer Vega gave Keanu a nod of appreciation, her face softening just a fraction. "Thanks for stepping in," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Keanu just nodded in return, his gaze still focused on Ethan. "I couldn't have left him," Keanu replied simply, his voice low, but filled with an unwavering conviction. The sirens outside began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of the restaurant returning to normal. But for Keanu, the world felt different now. The quiet strength of a child who had found the courage to ask for help, the way the officers had acted swiftly, everything had shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like he had made a difference. "Let's get you and your mom somewhere safe," Keanu said to Ethan, gently taking his hand. The boy nodded, his expression more relaxed now, though the worry still lingered in his eyes. Keanu stood up, guiding Ethan toward the door. The world outside had not yet returned to its usual pace, but Keanu knew one thing for sure, this day, this moment, would stay with him forever. And as they stepped out into the fading light of the afternoon, Keanu couldn't help but feel that the battle was far from over, but for now, they had won. The street outside felt oddly quiet as Keanu and Ethan made their way toward the waiting police cars. The usual noise of the city, the honking of cars and the chatter of pedestrians, seemed distant, muffled, like they were in a world of their own. Keanu kept a steady pace, his hand gently guiding Ethan, who walked close beside him, his small fingers still wrapped around the broken toy car. Ethan's face, once pale and fearful, was now marked with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in, but Keanu could see the tiny glimmers of hope beginning to form in the boy's eyes. It was a small thing, but it was everything. Keanu didn't speak right away, allowing the silence to hang between them. He didn't need to fill the space with words when they both knew the gravity of what had just happened. But when he glanced down at Ethan, the boy's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, it felt as if time had stopped. The connection between them, fragile and unexpected, had formed in the quiet of that restaurant, and now it was unspoken but undeniable. "You're safe now, Ethan," Keanu said softly, his voice steady, but there was a warmth to it that spoke volumes. Ethan nodded, but his gaze lingered on the toy car in his hand, as if he were searching for some sort of comfort in its broken form. "You think my mom's okay?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, the question heavy with a child's vulnerability. Keanu stopped walking, crouching down to meet Ethan's eyes at his level. "She's going to be okay," Keanu reassured him, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "We'll make sure of it." Ethan's eyes shone with unshed tears, but there was something else behind them now, a flicker of belief, like a small spark in the darkness. It was all Keanu could do to offer that spark, to give the boy something to hold on to in the midst of a world that had just turned upside down. The police cars were parked a short distance away, their lights flashing in the growing twilight, casting erratic shadows on the pavement. Officers Ramirez and Vega stood by the cars, their eyes scanning the street as they waited. The tension from the earlier confrontation had subsided, but there was still a palpable sense of urgency in the air. Keanu looked back at the officers, giving them a subtle nod before guiding Ethan toward the car. "We'll go to the hospital first," Keanu said, his tone final. He knew that the next step was crucial, getting Beth to safety, making sure she was stable. As they climbed into the back seat of the police car, Keanu could feel the weight of the world slowly lifting off his shoulders. The officers climbed in after them, Vega in the front seat and Ramirez at the wheel. The car pulled away from the curb, the flashing lights in the rearview mirror growing smaller as they drove through the quiet streets. The road to the hospital felt longer than it should have. Every moment stretched, each one carrying the weight of what was still left to do. Keanu glanced at Ethan, who was now leaning against the seat, his small body curled up slightly, as if he were trying to make himself small, to disappear. The boy's hand never left the toy car, still clutching it like a lifeline. "I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life," Ethan murmured after a long silence, his voice tinged with the rawness of everything he'd just experienced. Keanu's heart clenched, but he didn't know how to ease the depth of that fear. All he could do was offer his presence, steady and constant. "You're stronger than you think," Keanu said, his words simple but filled with an underlying truth. "You did the hardest thing, Ethan. You asked for help." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and something like awe. "But I'm just a kid," he said, his voice trailing off, unsure. Keanu shook his head gently, offering a reassuring smile. "Exactly. And you made the choice to stand up, to do the right thing. Not everyone has that courage, not even adults. You're brave, Ethan." Ethan didn't say anything else, but the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips told Keanu everything he needed to know. The weight in the boy's heart was still there, but it was lighter now, and that made all the difference. The car continued down the road, the city lights flickering past, each one a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. Keanu looked out the window, his thoughts drifting to Beth. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he knew she was strong. She had to be. A few blocks later, they arrived at the hospital. The air inside the car shifted once more as the officers escorted them inside, and Keanu held Ethan's hand tightly. Beth was already being tended to when they arrived. She lay on the hospital bed, looking pale but conscious, her eyes fluttering open when she heard Ethan's voice. The relief on her face was palpable, and when Ethan rushed to her side, his small hand resting in hers, Keanu could see the bond between mother and son. It was unbreakable. Keanu stood at the doorway for a moment, watching them. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to interrupt the quiet reunion, but he knew this was where his part in their story ended, for now. He had done what he could. He had kept his promise to Ethan. As he turned to leave, the weight of the moment settled in once more. Keanu felt the exhaustion from the day's events start to catch up with him, but it wasn't the physical toll that lingered. It was something deeper. It was the knowledge that sometimes, being a hero wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic battles. Sometimes, it was about standing between the darkness and the light, giving someone the chance to find their way back. And as Keanu stepped out of the room, the quiet buzz of the hospital faded behind him, and he allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. For now, they were safe. And sometimes, that was enough. The day had started like any other, but it had unfolded into something neither Keanu nor Ethan would ever forget. The quiet moments that had seemed like refuge were now the stuff of history, forever imprinted in their minds. As Keanu stood outside the hospital, his eyes scanning the now quiet night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had changed, not just in the world, but in him as well. He leaned against the car, the cool night air washing over him, the steady hum of the city barely breaking the silence. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there, lost in thought, until he heard footsteps approach. It was one of the officers, Ramirez, walking up with a small folder in his hand, his expression somber but relieved. "Everything's under control," Ramirez said, offering Keanu a quiet nod. "We've got him in custody, and the evidence we needed was right there. He won't be able to hurt anyone again." Keanu nodded, grateful for the officer's words. But even as the relief seeped into his bones, a lingering question weighed on him. "What happens next for Ethan?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Ramirez paused, his gaze flicking toward the hospital. "He'll be safe. His mother's in good hands, and Child Protective Services will make sure they both have the support they need moving forward. It won't be easy, but they have a chance to rebuild. Thanks to you." Keanu didn't respond right away, his mind swirling with the images of Ethan, clutching his broken toy car, standing in the middle of the storm. The boy had been through more than anyone should ever endure, yet there he was, still standing, still fighting, still looking for hope. And Keanu had been there to help him find it. "Sometimes, you don't know what you're walking into," Keanu said, his voice distant, almost to himself. "You think you're just going through another day. Then someone crosses your path, and suddenly, it's not just about you anymore. It's about them. And you can't turn away." Ramirez gave a slight nod, his face showing a deep understanding. "You're right. It changes you. Makes you realize just how much one act, one choice can affect everything." Keanu looked back toward the hospital doors, knowing that, despite the words of comfort, there were still scars to heal, still battles to fight. The night was far from over, and yet there was a strange sense of peace in the air. It wasn't the peace of everything being perfect, it was the peace that came from knowing that, in that moment, they had done what they could. "I'll check in on them tomorrow," Keanu said, straightening up and pushing off the car. "I just want to make sure they're okay." "I think that's a good idea," Ramirez replied with a smile, and then, after a pause, added, "You've done more than enough, Keanu. Don't sell yourself short. You helped give them back a future." Keanu didn't say anything more, just gave a simple nod and turned to leave. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from his team about an upcoming interview. But as he stared at the screen, the words didn't seem to matter as much. The world outside his bubble of fame, of work, of constant motion, none of it felt as urgent as it once had. He slid the phone back into his pocket and opened the door to the car. Sitting inside, He started the engine, the purr of the car almost comforting in its familiarity. The city lights glimmered around him as he drove, the soft hum of the road beneath his wheels a subtle reminder that the world kept moving, even after everything had changed. In the quiet of the night, Keanu thought about Ethan again. About his courage, his strength. About how, even in the darkest of moments, the boy had still found a way to trust. And in the end, it wasn't just Keanu who had helped. It was Ethan, too, finding his way out of the storm, one brave step at a time. The city passed by, but for Keanu, there was only one thought on his mind: sometimes, the quietest acts of courage make the biggest difference. And, for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like he understood that truth, not as a line in a script, but as something that had taken root in his heart. Something real. Something that would stay with him, even after the lights had dimmed and the world had moved on. He drove through the streets, the weight of the day lifting with every mile, knowing that sometimes the smallest things, like offering a hand, or standing firm in the face of fear, could change everything.